We do, in fact, have a lecture on Monday. So Monday and Tuesday are, technically speaking, still class days. And in fact, Monday's lecture is going to wrap up our 4-part look at dinosaur physiology. So last time we looked at what are some of the requirements for an organism to actually be an effective warm-blooded animal. And we saw, in terms of food processing and locomotion and things of that nature, the dinosaurs had those. And now we're moving on to issues of gas and heat and nutrient exchange, that is ultimately lungs and hearts. And so I finished last time by introducing this idea of Carrier's constraint, first noted by David Carrier, a respiratory physiologist who studies non-mammalian vertebrates, and how different, and we're beginning to look at how different groups break that. So Carrier's constraint, again, is the fact that the ancestral condition in vertebrates is rib breathing and air gulping, and it is difficult to do rib breathing if you've got this lateral, side-to-side locomotion, the ancestral form of locomotion. And so you can breathe or you can walk, but you can't do both simultaneously. And that constraint gets broken by several different groups of animals at different points of the history of amniotes, and we're going to see what ways dinosaurs would have broken that. So here we see a lizard up top that is subject to Carrier's constraint, and a dog below that can run and breathe at the same time, and therefore is capable of using aerobic respiration while moving, as opposed to this poor lizard, which has to do anaerobic respiration while moving. Now, one form of cheating actually evolves within the history of lizards, and that's a throat pump, where the bones associated with the tongue, the hyoid bones, evolved to expand and contract the throat region, which adds an extra way to pump more oxygen into the body while the animal's moving, even though its lungs themselves are still subject to Carrier's constraint. And it's not a coincidence that the lizards for which this has been noticed, first baranid lizards and maybe a couple other groups, tend to be the more active lizards. And in fact, in the Monday's lecture, I'm going to talk about how monitor lizards may be one of our best living models of what the first steps towards warm-bloodedness are. Monitor lizards are not warm-blooded, they're cold-blooded animals, but they have a set of adaptations that suggest maybe these are the starting point. So the ability to get extra oxygen into the body while moving. We, on the mammalian side, cheat by the use of a diaphragm. So it is a mammalian trait. This is, in fact, if you learned about respiration at some point, this is the form of respiration you learned about, because you're going to learn about what humans do. It's in fact not limited to mammals. It's among mammals and other advanced members of Therapsida. And the thing that we do to cheat is we have this diaphragm muscle. So the diaphragm is a sheet of muscle that is perpendicular to the axis of the body. And when it contracts, our lungs, which are flexible and which are tidally driven, that is, air goes in and then air goes out, which is the ancestral state for lungs. The diaphragm contracts, the lungs expand, and air flows in. And then it relaxes, it snaps back to its old position, and it pumps the air out. Now, we still do rib breathing. We still use our rib muscles to breathe. But that's not where most of the tidal action goes. Most of the tidal action is driven by this diaphragm muscle. This diaphragm muscle is separate from the muscles of locomotion. So it can be active while we're moving. By the way, this results in terms of a morphology, a skeletal morphology, where the thorax of the body, or the torso of the body, is divided into a section that has ribs up front, but anteriorly, that's the thoracic section, and a lumbar section behind. And the way it's reflected in terms of the skeleton is the thoracic part of the dorsals, they've got ribs. They've got big ribs. And behind the diaphragm, there aren't ribs, or let's go large ribs, and that's the lumbar region. Incidentally, if you were to go into medicine, the diaphragm also separates how much money you make. Because although people who work in gastrointestinal and liver and so forth, those surgeons still get a lot of money. But if you're a thoracic surgeon, that is just one step really below neurosurgery in terms of the profession. So if you're working in hearts and lungs, which are all stuff in the thoracic region, you get a lot more money. Okay. Now, this gives us an osteological correlate. Remember, a bony feature, which correlates with a soft tissue feature, that we can use to try to trace out what extinct therapsids might have had a diaphragm and which ones didn't. And we can see here that these forms that have lumbar vertebrae without extra ribs are almost certainly forms that had a diaphragm and therefore had this extra form of respiration, this extra way to pump oxygen while they're moving. Additionally, eventually within mammalian evolution, and by the way, we'll get to mammal evolution the week after Thanksgiving. It'll be the Wednesday the week after Thanksgiving. We see eventually the origin of upright limbs, parasagittal limbs, convergent with what dinosaurs had. Now, it turns out crocodilians cheat as well. They have what's called a liver pump, or a hepatic piston, which just means liver pump. So in their case, the liver is functionally analogous to the mammalian or therapsid diaphragm. The liver moves backwards and forwards, and it compresses and expands the lung volume. So the lungs get bigger and smaller. And it does so, in part, by using a mobile pubis. So take a look at crocodilians and modern alligators' pelvis. It's got, there's the ilium, there's the ischium, here's the pubis. And notice the pubis does not contact the acetabulum. In everything else we've seen, all three bones, ilium, ischium, and pubis, surround the hip socket, surround the ischium, surround the acetabulum. But in crocodilians, and some of the extinct members of the crocodile line, the pubis is mobile. It's got an articulation with the rest of the pelvis. It doesn't go all the way to the acetabulum. And so when we see that structure, we can be relatively certain that this animal had the hepatic piston. And so crocodilians actually are somewhat more active, although they have a particularly interesting mode of life that we'll talk about on Monday. But somewhat more active when they're being active than, say, a lizard, a snake, or a turtle. And so they've got this liver pumping forward and backwards. So here we see it in sort of a diagram view from the side of the torso. And notice that the muscles involved, the muscles that are pulling on the pubis and pulling from the pubis on the liver, are originating from the pelvis itself. So pelvic muscles are key in the respiration of this group of living archosaurs. Also, new data is now about 10 years old, shows that crocodilians, like birds, as we will see, have unidirectional airflow into their lungs. The lungs are moving tidally. They're expanding and contracting. So in that sense, they're similar to mammalian lungs. That's the ancestral condition. But the air comes in one side and flows out the other. So it's not coming in to a blind sac and then getting shunted back out again. And that makes it a little more efficient than what mammals have and what non-archosaurian reptiles have. But we'll see that more fully expanded when we see fully developed when we look at bird lungs momentarily. So here's a diagram I think you can see a little better. We've got the lungs of the crocodile in blue. The liver gets pulled back by these pelvic muscles. Also, it involves expansion of the rib, and it involves motion of the gastralia, so the belly ribs and the sternum. This area expands, the lungs expand, the air flows in, and then the liver snaps back, they compress, the ribs come back in, the sternum comes back up, the gastralia compress, and the air goes out. But then there's birds. In birds, first of all, the lung is rigid. The lung never changes shape or size. It's also relatively small, which you might not think about. You might think is weird. at first glance, it is weird. Why would these animals with such a high metabolic rate have small lungs? Well, that's because in the case of birds, the lungs is only used for gas exchange. It's not used for moving the air around. In almost everything else, the action of the expanding and contracting of the lung is moving air around. Instead, birds have this complicated set of air sacs in the body. They're part of the respiratory system. They're what's pumping the air back and forth. But they do not absorb oxygen or exchange CO2 back out into the air. They're not involved in gas exchange, but they are involved in shunting the air around. Now, in the case of birds, those air sacs aren't just limited to the soft tissue. They actually invade the bone. They invade the vertebrae. They invade the appendicular bones. Like you here see air sac inside the humerus here in this cartoon. And in this case, they took a goose or duck, some Ancestral, and they injected some powdered rubber into the cadaver and then removed everything but the skeleton and the air sacs. So you can see how extensive these air sacs are in the body of a bird. So how does the system work? Well, in this case, anterior is off over here. So bird's head's over here. It breathes in. Air comes from the outside world and inflates the posterior set of air sacs. Any air that was in the posterior set of air sac flows through the lung and exchanges its gas, drops off its oxygen, picks up its CO2, and goes to begin to inflate the anterior air sac. So that's breathing in. Exhalation. Breathing out. The air sac in the posterior part contracts, flowing, pushing the air into the lungs where it drops off oxygen and picks up CO2. And the waste air in the anterior air sac flows out of the throat. Notice that in a bird, both breathing in and breathing out is getting fresh air into the lungs and waste air out of the bloodstream, waste CO2. That's twice as efficient as what we do. We breathe in, we get fresh air into the lungs, and breathe out, we get rid of our waste air. In a bird, both breathing in and breathing out, we're getting gas exchange, both fresh air in and old air out. And then start again, breathe in, breathe out. So breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. It is far more efficient than anything in any other group of vertebrates. And the muscles used to pump this, because remember, the lung is rigid. The lung isn't expanding and contracting. But those air sacs are being pumped. And the muscles associated with the air sac are coming from the pelvis, just like in crocodilians. Some of them are going anterior. They're grabbing onto the sternum and the rib cage, and it's contracting the body and expanding it. And some are going posteriorly, and the body is contracting or expanding back there. And it works as a bellows of the air sac system, flowing the air through the lung. Now, additionally, inside the lung, this rigid lung, the air is passing the arteries, the capillaries, in the opposite direction. It's a counter-current exchange. So the fresh air is coming from the posterior heading forward, and it's dropping its load of oxygen into the blood, but that blood has already dropped off its CO2 into the outflowing air. So a counter-current exchange, and those of you who are like in engineering may know, is a really efficient way of exchanging substances or materials. So the air is flowing from the posterior anteriorly, and the blood is flowing anteriorly posterior, from antero-posteriorly. Super efficient. Now, Carrier and his colleague, Colleen Farmer, who is not the Colleen Farmer who is a respiratory physiologist who worked here at the University of Maryland, but is an entirely different respiratory physiologist named Colleen Farmer. Small world. They would get each other's mail all the time. People would be writing to the wrong one. Anyway, They worked out this model of what an ancestral archosaur might have, based on the fact that the muscles involved in respiration in both crocodilians and birds are homologous muscles. But the ancestral archosaurs didn't resemble either birds or crocodilians in morphology. They had rigid pubes, so they didn't have the hepatic piston. And there was no sign of the air sacs invading all the bones, and so forth. So a suggestion that Carrier and Farmer have is that the ancestral archosaur respiration was belly breathing, that the muscles were running from the pelvis onto the gastralia, which are used in respiration in crocodilians. They're not used in birds because birds have actually lost their gastralia. And then they would tug on the gastralia would pull outwards, this would expand the lung area, the air would flow in, they would contract, and the air would flow out. So by the way, in this case they don't use inspiration, so they don't use inhalation and exhalation, they use the synonyms inspiration, which doesn't mean like, woo! Spiritus in Latin is just breath. So when we say spirit, we really mean breath. But the idea is you're inspired. It's like the breath of the gods, or the breath of God has come into you, so you're inspired to do something. But it really means just breathing in. And to expire, we still use that in English for the final time that you let out air. But in fact, in physiology, you can use it any time you let out air. So breathing in, breathing out. And they noted that the morphology of the gastralia of archosaurs is a little different than many typical diapsids and other, actually for that matter, other amniotes or other vertebrates, in that each gastralium contacts two gastralia on the opposite side. So we have sort of the zigzag articulation in the middle, and that actually was, the idea is that those articulations would help them have a more rigid structure or more consistent structure as they would expand and then contract and expand and contract. And they also noted that if you extend the pubis and the ischium, as they become more elongated, that changes the volume of the air that can be pumped. You're increasing the moment arm, you're increasing the volume of air that can be pumped along. And so here's their attempt to reconstruct, in this case, a dinosaur. It's Allosaurus from lateral and ventral view, and then some earlier, then some Eumenuraptorans, Enantiornithine and Deinonychus. Now, let's see if we can sort of tie these things together. For one thing, we note that ornithodyrans, so Dinosauromorphs and Pterosauromorphs, have a parasagittal stance in which the limbs are directly underneath the body. This evolved convergently, probably. I put a question mark because under some phylogenies for pseudoseuchians, the ancestral pseudoseuchian actually has a parasagittal stance. But typically it looks like to be a convergent evolution. Oh, hang on. Go back here. Having a parasagittal stance means you're not twisting your body side to side. When you're moving, your limbs are going forward and backwards, so that already helps get rid of Carrier's constraint. You're not compressing your lungs during locomotion, and therefore, you can get more aerobic activity, especially if you've got something else pumping air. And in this case, the idea of the belly breathing, again, that's a set of muscles that you're now no longer using for locomotion, so you can keep on pumping air into your body. You're aerating while moving. And we note that in Dinosauromorphs, especially advanced Dinosauromorphs, this group Dracohores, so silosaurids and dinosaurs, and convergently in specialized pseudoseuchians, the ischium and pubis get elongated. And again, that seems to have increased basically the lever arm of the action that's going on in terms of pumping air in there. And in fact, those pseudoseuchians that evolve the elongate pelvic bones are ones that have parasagittal stance. So Arizonosaurus down here, the Poposaurid, or Poposauroid at least, In fact, it was thought to be a dinosaur when they first found it because of its elongate pubis and ischium, and then they found more of the skeleton, and they noticed it didn't have an open acetabulum and turned out to be a pseudoscian. And so, under the sort of standard model, you have a parasagittal stance evolving here in the ancestral ornithodyrans, and elongate pubis and ischium up here in dracohores. So maybe bumping up the ability to have oxygen flow in there even more, but with the idea that maybe parasagittal stance might be actually ancestral for Archosauria. And I happen to show a pseudoscian here that actually has these very elongate pubes and ischium, but those are definitely derived in pseudoscian. But what about the air sacs? Well, we've recognized the possibility of air sacs in dinosaurs for over a century. So if we take here's a CT scan of a modern ostrich, we can see in white is where the bone is. We've got the neural cavity in here and so forth, but these sacs, these openings here, are part of the air sacs that have invaded the bone, whereas this gray, that's the flesh, and these are the air sacs in the flesh itself. Here, however, is a vertebra of Apatosaurus, and we see it's full of these air sac chambers. We've known about them in sauropods and in therappods since the 1800s. In fact, if you remember, this was one of the traits used to first recognize Saurischia. That sauropodomorphs and theropods had air sac chambers, or they had open chambers in the vertebrae, and eventually recognized that these are air sac chambers. And in fact, in modern birds, different air sacs invade different bones. So just to orient you, anterior is over here, so that's the furcula, it's the scaphocoracoid. There's the pelvis, there's the tail, it's pygostyle. Different air sacs invade different vertebrae, and we can map out which air sacs were present in extinct Saurischians because we can see which vertebrae have been invaded by air sacs. We do that by looking at the holes, the foramina that enter the bone. So here's a pneumatic foramen. There's a pneumatic foramen, or actually a couple pneumatic foramina invading the bone. And so a reconstruction of where the air sacs are in some sauropods. So indeed, pneumatic or air chambers in Saurischian vertebrae are common. They are the trait, one of the traits that unites them. So a pneumatic foramen, pneumatic foramina is plural, pneumatic foramen is singular, where the air sac invades. And just showing again in a modern bird, and you can see how pneumatized, that is how full of air sacs the bone is in that turkey. Now, what's curious is that in modern bird ontogeny, the first vertebrae to be invaded by the air sacs, so the air sacs are already present in the flesh, but they start to invade the bone. The first ones to invade the bones in ontogeny are the posterior cervicals. And that in early Saurischians, early theropods and early sauropodomorphs, the bones that clearly are pneumatized are the posterior cervicals. And in both clades and in a bird ontogenetically, they invade anteriorly into the cervicals and posteriorly into the rest of the body as you get either more derived, in the case of the taxa, or older, in the case of a living bird. Now, for a long time, people said, we don't see any air sacs in non-sauropod sauropodomorphs, so prosauropods. It turns out they were there all along and people weren't noticing them. So, for instance, here are some of these pneumatic foramina going into, in this case, not the centrum, but the neural arch, on a specimen of Plateosaurus that's been on display for more than a century, and people hadn't really paid attention to it. So, they're there, they just don't invade as much. So, pneumatic foramina definitely present in Saurischia. It turns out they're also present in pterosaurs. Pterosaurs, who we'll talk more about, we'll talk a little bit about them next Monday, and we'll talk a lot about them the following Monday. They also have a lot of traits very similar to dinosaurs, and in some cases especially to theropods, relevant to thermal ecology. And one of the things is they've got lots of pneumatic foramina. So one thought is that the presence of pneumatic foramina, that's what indicates air sacs, and that air sacs evolved independently in pterosaurs and in Saurischian dinosaurs. However, there's an alternative hypothesis. And that is, when we see pneumatic foramina, that signs the air sacs are big enough to invade the bones, and that air sacs themselves were present in the oldest ornithodyrans, or maybe even before that. And that they just independently became so large that they began to invade the bone. Now, part of the argument for that is that on the exterior surface of the vertebrae, so here's a sauropod vertebra, there aren't just the foramina of the air sacs invading the bone. There's also these divots, these fossae over the bone. And in life, that's where the air sacs sit. And that occasionally they do invade the bone. Now, these fossae are present, especially on the neural arch, not just in Saurischians and pterosaurs, but they're widespread among Archosaurs. And so it might be that air sacs are present throughout many Archosaurs, but they only become big enough to invade the bone, where they need to take up that space in Saurischians and in pterosaurs. And just to show you the sort of variability here, here is a single emu, so a single individual. On the right side, there's no pneumatic foramen, but there is this divot. That's where the air sac sat. If that's all we had, people might argue, well, look, they didn't have air sacs. In the same individual, on the left side, the air sac actually invades the bone. So it is variable even on one bone in one individual. So we have the evidence from modern crocs of unidirectional airflow into the body. We have air sacs invading the vertebrae at least in the dinosaur line within Saurischia, and invading the limbs, that's way up as we get into aviale. Although in some cases we have like air sacs invade the furcula in non-avian theropods. Now what about ornithischians? Ornithischians don't show pneumatic foramina. They do show the fossae that might reflect the presence of air sacs. And ornithischians, other than heterodontosaurs, don't have gastralia. How are they breathing? Well, Carrier and Farmer years ago had some suggestions about, maybe some of the ornithischians are doing something weird with regard to the pelvis, because then pelvic muscles seem to be the center of respiration in Archosaurs. But an idea that's been floating around since the 1980s, Mike Brett Sermon suggested with regard to hadrosaurs, but now people are looking and saying it might be widespread throughout ornithischians, is that although we lose gastralia, and of course the pelvis, the shaft of the pelvis is typically small, and especially derived ornithischians, so there's not going to be a lot of muscles coming off of that these animals typically have what's called an anterior pubic process. So the bone going down here, that's the main shaft of the pubis. That's homologous to the pubis in a Saurischian or whatever. But this new forward projection, which in the case of some things like some ceratopsids, it's all the pubis. They've lost the shaft. This anterior pubic process, some people have argued maybe these are associated with anterior-facing muscles involved in respiration. And indeed, in a paper that came out earlier this year, there is a hypothetical reconstruction, a model that has been developed for a possible form of the evolution of respiration in the history of ornithischians. And it's sort of a hybrid model between what we see in Saurischians and what we see in Crocodilians. So there's already evidence based on the morphology of the vertebrae and ribs that in ornithischians and in silosaurids, which are either proto-dinosaurs or early ornithischians, that the front end of the lung is rigid, as it is in Saurischians, but that the posterior end was more flexible, like it is in a crocodile, or pretty much anything else. That when we get to early ornithischians, we have a backwards pointing pubis, so we're not probably having muscles running off of that against it, but that the development of the APP, the anterior pubic process, that's where the muscles are now attached to pull onto the flexible back end of the lung, and that in derived groups like ornithopods and ceratopsians, the APP is most definitely much larger than it is in earlier forms, and therefore we've got this big expansion of these muscles going forward. At the same time, we've lost the gastralia. So, actually, I should point that out here. I've got animation. So, flexible part of lung, rigid part of lung. Pubic muscles from the APP are pumping the flexible parts, and the derived clades, gastralia is lost, and the pubic bellows, not public, it would be pubic or pelvic bellows are strengthened. Brand new slides, a brand new typo. Okay, so hypothetical, it's an interesting model. We'll see how it plays out. So this would, again, be giving us evidence of an increased level of respiration while moving in derived ornithischians. And remember, when we get to really derived ornithischians like hadrosaurids and ceratopsids, we also have all these derived feeding adaptations and evidence of sort of increased cursoriality. So that's lungs. That's half the respiration. How about the circulatory system, the other half of respiration? Well, you were probably told in some class on biology or zoology at some point that reptiles have 3-chambered hearts and mammals and birds have 4-chambered hearts, and that's a lie. Okay, it's not a lie. It is imprecise. In fact, amphibians, testudines, that is turtles, and squamates, well, I should say, and lepidosaurs, tuatara, lizards, and snakes, they do have 3-chambered hearts. That's true. So how does a 3-chambered heart work? Well, since it's a cycle, we can start anywhere. Let's start with the blood coming from the lungs. So deoxygenated blood goes into the lungs, drops off its CO2, picks up its O2, and goes into the heart, where it gets pumped into a single ventricle. And in that single ventricle, the blood coming from the lungs is mixing with the blood coming from the rest of the body. And so some of that oxygenated blood is going out to the rest of the body, which is where we want it to do, to drop off its oxygen and pick up its CO2. But some of that oxygenated blood is going right back to the lungs, which isn't super efficient, but it works for these things. But in mammals, and in birds, and in freaking crocodilians, so reptiles, non-avian reptiles, do have 4-chambered hearts, if those creatures are crocodilians, who always get left out when people are stereotyping reptiles. Reptiles don't have parental care. Reptiles only have 3-chambered hearts, except for crocodilians. So they have 4-chambered, and how does this work? The blood coming from the heart goes to the lungs, drops off its CO2, picks up its O2, goes to the heart, where it's entirely segregated from the deoxygenated blood, so that only oxygenated blood is going to the body to drop off its oxygen, pick up its CO2, go back to the heart, where all the deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs. This is a lot more efficient. Additionally, I should throw this out. Crocodilians have a 4-chambered heart, but they've got a special adaptation. They can shift it to basically be a 2-chambered heart. When they're underwater and not active, there's no reason to send blood to the lungs, and they can stop it. They can stop blood going to the lungs. That's the most specialized heart that any vertebrate has. But there's another aspect that you get with this more efficient sort of lung or heart setup, and that is the blood pressure in the lungs can be different than the blood pressure to the rest of the body. You can't do that with a 3-chambered heart because it's the same pressure coming out of the ventricle. But here, we can decrease the pressure going to the lungs and ramp up the pressure going to the rest of the body. Why would that be important? Well, first of all, talk about why that's important in a moment. This is pretty clear in terms of its distribution. 4-chambered hearts for Archosauria, 4-chambered hearts for Mammalia, 3-chambered hearts for the others, and by inference, all the extinct Archosaurs would have had a 4-chambered heart. So here we go. As the brain gets higher and higher above the ground, it requires greater blood pressure to get oxygen to the brain. If the blood to the lungs and the blood to the body are at the same pressure, you either won't have sufficient blood pressure to get it to the brain, or so much pressure in the lungs that the blood flows out of the capillaries into the lungs. And both of these conditions produce both these situations would produce a condition known in medicine as death, which is not a favorable thing for an organism to operate. You don't want to bleed into your lungs or not get oxygen to your brain. But by separating the two parts of the circulatory system, that's not a problem. You can have a high blood pressure for the body and a lower blood pressure for the lungs, and you can get tall. And note that all the living creatures and all extinct creatures that we know of with parasagittal stance are nested within groups phylogenetically that have 4-chambered hearts. So not all mammals are tall, not all archosaurs are tall, but all tall animals, either mammals or tall archosaurs, are within a group with 4-chambered hearts. So having a 3-chambered heart isn't a failure. It works perfectly well for the thousands upon thousands of species of lepidosaurs and amphibians and the hundreds of species of turtles. But none of them are tall. Okay, so we can get the oxygen and the nutrients to the cells. We can remove the CO2 and the waste products from the cells and get rid of them. We can continue to oxygenate our bodies while moving. So we've got a lot of attributes going on in dinosaurs that are effective in terms of being an endothermic animal. But endotherms, well, any organism runs up against some physics. And that is, if you're a small-bodied animal, the ratio of your surface area to your volume is quite high. And therefore, the heat within your body tends to leak out. If you're going to a lot of effort to ramp up your metabolism, to get more food and so forth, in order to increase your internal body temperature, it would be a darn shame if all that effort was wasted by all the heat flowing out of your body. Not coincidentally, small-bodied organisms with high metabolic rates evolved insulation. So we have feathers in modern birds, we have fur in mammals. For that matter, we have fur in metabolically active insects. Think about bees. Think about butterflies and moths, especially. They're furry. It helps keep the heat in the body. And of course, we know that at least some small dinosaurs of both theraphods and ornithischians had a certain amount of insulation. Probably for display, but potentially for insulation to keep heat in the body as well. And that even some larger ones, like here's Deinonychus, were fully insulated. However, having a highly insulated body is actually detrimental if you're big. It's helpful if you're small, but it's potentially detrimental if you're a big animal. And this has to do with physics. Your surface area to volume decreases as you get larger. So before, we looked at surface area to volume with regard to, say, cross-sectional anatomy or the base of the foot or something, and how you get mechanically weaker the bigger you get because more mass is being subjected to any given unit area. In this case, the larger you get, the smaller your surface area ratio. As body size increases, your surface area to volume decreases. And so an organism becomes thermally isolated from the outside world. In fact, some people have thought about maybe dinosaurs and other large-bodied animals take advantage of this, what they call gigantothermy. You're homeothermic by size alone. certainly that would help. You can maintain homeothermy without necessarily metabolic regulation. But there's a problem. How do you really maintain it? You're going to have the heat in there. What happens when you're being active and you can't dump that heat? That actually becomes a problem. Also, we'll come back to that in a moment, but here's an aside. Maybe a big adult dinosaur could have been a gigantotherm, but the little babies aren't going to be. They have too high a surface area to volume ratio. And baby dinosaurs definitely show tachymetabolic growth rates. So we can't say that maybe dinosaurs achieved warm bloodedness simply by being big. That might apply for the adults, but certainly couldn't apply for the babies. And also, a recent study looked, this is sort of a very clever technique, at using isotope ratios in eggshell to determine the body temperature of the mother. Because it turns out oxygen isotopes in carbonate minerals will have a ratio between 18 and 16 oxygen that reflects the temperature at time of crystallization. In this case, the time of crystallization is in the oviduct of a mom, and so it's a way of having sort of a paleothermometer of the mother dinosaur at the time she was laying the eggs. And we see here reflected in the dotted line the size-based temperature model reflecting gigantothermy. That as you get larger and larger and larger, you're going to have a higher temperature because you can't dump heat. And we see that maybe some of the big sauropods could potentially be gigantotherms. The temperatures are consistent with the gigantothermic model, but that these theropods and these ornithischian eggs do not show that. They do not reflect that. They show body temperatures that are inconsistent with gigantothermy in the mom. So back to this issue of what to do with excess heat if you're a big animal. Well, one way of getting rid of excess heat is radiative cooling. And there are some dinosaurs that tend to have big structures, large surface areas without much volume, that might have been used by radiative cooling, or maybe to a certain amount of evaporative cooling, but mostly radiative. So the idea is your heat's going up in there, it's radiating into the outside world. Maybe you put yourself into an area where there's a wind flow going, and that could increase it. We see this in big modern mammals. It's one of the reasons elephants have big ears. We can see here this temperature, this infrared photograph of an elephant, and you can see how cooler the ears are. They're dumping the heat out of their ears. And that's especially important for this part of the body, because one of the most important parts of the body is, I know this is going to be yet another radical revelation from Dr. Holtz. One of the most important parts of the body is the brain. But the reason it's significant here when we're talking about warmth is the brain is a relatively small volume. And in the case of an elephant, it's huge compared to anything we're dealing with the dinosaur. And therefore, it's easy to get its temperature up a lot. And as I was once told in my chemistry class as a high school student, and it's stuck with me ever since, you cannot uncook a brain, just like you can't uncook an egg. If those proteins get too heated up and transform, there's no going back. And so having features that could dump heat, especially in the region where the brain is, that's good. And it turns out we see that in animals. A particularly important one is what's called respiratory turbinates. And these are useful in terms of evaporative cooling, which is actually far more effective than simply radiative cooling. Evaporative cooling, that implies that there's water involved, and that sort of pulls the heat away from the body. We mammals have another form of evaporative cooling, and that's sweating. And that's one of the main ways we cool off. But sweating is a mammalian trait. We don't see that in Archosaurs. So, respiratory turbinates are this scroll work of bone, or in the case of birds, cartilage, which are covered by an epithelium, a layer of tissue. And they're in the snouts of various tetrapods, and they're useful for regulating the heat of incoming and outgoing air, and for that matter, retrieving some of the outgoing moisture and wetting the incoming air. So here's the sagittal cross-sections of a mammal down here, a bird, and a crocodilian, and this stuff here. These are the respiratory turbinates. So here's one in a seal. You see a complex scroll work inside its nose. Those are the nares we're looking into. And that would have been covered with an epithelium. And so here in a dog, you breathe out. It can cool down the air. Well, the blood is flowing through there. The air goes by. It takes some of the heat away from the blood on the snout. And then when you breathe back in, it actually warms it back into your lungs. That's actually helpful if it's in a cool environment, too. It keeps the air coming into your body from being too cold. And here we see it going on in a goose. But it's noteworthy that cold-blooded animals don't have much in the way of respiratory turbinates or even a volume in which the respiratory turbinates can sit. People have looked at how they help respiratory turbinates control water loss. So here's a mammal. Actually, it's a bunch of different mammals. They're summarized here, and a bunch of different lizards. And over the course of a day, both of them lose comparable amounts of moisture. But if you have a mammal that can't use its respiratory turbinates, and these guys didn't dissect them out. What they did is they actually covered the nostrils. So if you can't use your nostrils, then you can't use your respiratory turbinates. Oh, here's an experiment you can do. It's getting the right time of year. Breathe out from your mouth. And when it's cold enough, you see the clouds of vapor. But before it gets really cold, when you breathe out through your nose, you don't see the clouds of vapor. When it gets really cold, you will. And the difference there is that your nose is collecting a lot of that vapor on the way out. So a mammal without respiratory turbinates is losing a substantial fraction of its body mass every day in terms of moisture. And again, you don't want to do that. That will kill you. But it also is useful for dumping heat. Now, the recognition of the significance of respiratory turbinates has a great bearing on our understanding of dinosaur noses. Something I've hinted at when we looked at diversity, but I didn't get to. So if you look, here's a Giraffatitan, a Brachiosaurid, and we've got the skull, and then people wondering where the nostril would be, all these different models, and A looks like where it is. The nostrils are down here. So the air's coming out through this big narial region, through this fleshy structures on the outside, and then out through the nostrils. Why such big noses? We got here a Tyrannosaurus as well. Let's see over that. Now, in dinosaurs, it's difficult to map out exactly where the fleshy epithelium, the fleshy tissue is with regard to airflow. At least for most of them. Because most dinosaurs have pretty open snout regions. And so the fleshy structures we don't preserve. But there are two groups, Ankylosaurians and Pachycephalosaurs, who have all the secondary ossification of the head, and that actually constrains what's going on the inside of the body. And so work by various colleagues, Jason Bork especially, have looked at this. So here's a restoration of the airflow. We got some great animation for this. So first of all, we got the blood flowing from the body where it's really warm. It hits the respiratory turbinates, it dumps its heat into the airflow, and that means only cool air, so only cool blood, is going back into the body to the brain. And that's really important because the next stop after the nose is the brain. That's conserved in all sorts of vertebrates. And it's notable that all big dinosaur groups, so all groups with big dinosaurs get bigger nares, both ontogenetically, from babies to adults, and phylogenetically when we get larger forms. So there's sauropodomorphs, here are theropods, here's a small ceratopsian and a big ceratopsid, and in all cases the narial region gets really big and elaborate. Here's Triceratops. Now there's another side effect of having this nice respiratory turbinate in there. It actually deflects. That's a reconstruction without the turbinates. We put it in. And now it actually redeflects a little bit of that airflow to the back of the narial chamber where the body can pick up the scent. So it ties back to our look at senses, but most of the airflow is involved in respiration. We see complex narial structures inside the snouts of ankylosaurs, and especially in ankylosaurids. And yes, it may help with vocalization, but almost certainly it's a big part of physiology. And so in various restorations by Bork and colleagues, they've also looked at that. And it looks like that's a heat exchanger as well. And I'm going to finish with this wonderful animation coming up. So there's all the details, and here's this wonderful animation. In this case, they're emphasizing the warming, the air that's going to the lungs, and cool air comes from the outside. Or, in terms of the blood, cooling the blood before it goes back to the brain. So next time we'll pick up with looking at some other aspects of radiation and other heat dumping in dinosaurs, as well as looking at the evolution of where warm-bloodedness probably picked up in the history of the dinosaur lineage. So I will see you then.